Hey, welcome back to my channel. My name is Bridget and I'm an artist and art educator. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to make a watercolor bouquet of flowers. Using a pencil and a light hand, I am drawing a triangle for the paper that wraps the bouquet. To give the appearance of folded wrapping paper around the bouquet, I am adding 2 points at the top of the wrapping paper, and then at the bottom, I am creating a diagonal line that goes across the triangle where it would normally come to a point, and drawing rectangular stems coming out from underneath it. For the flowers, I'm starting off drawing circles outlining where I want the flowers to be positioned within the bouquet. It might be a little bit hard to see on camera, but that's because I'm using such a light hand because I don't want these lines to be very bold. I want them to be easily erasable. That way I can go over these lines with more details and then I can easily erase those guiding lines. I've created this picture-in-picture effect so that way you can get a better look at what I'm doing. And you can see that I'm making smaller circles and bigger circles of different sizes because the flowers within the bouquet are going to be different sizes. And if you're creating your own bouquet from imagination, I recommend that you look at some reference photos. I'll be looking at a reference photo throughout my drawing, but you won't be able to see it on camera. But I find that working from a reference photo is so integral to creating a piece that looks more realistic. I find that bouquets with a variety of flowers and shapes and sizes are a lot more interesting to look at, but there are some really beautiful bouquets out there that have flowers that are all the exact same size and the exact same type of flower. So really it's up to you, but just keep that in mind as you create your guiding lines. At the bottom of the bouquet where the flowers just poke out from the top of the wrapping paper, I'm adding in some greenery. And I'm just going along the edges of the bouquet and figuring out where I want all the greenery to go. And then I start with the stems first, figure out how long I want them to be, how I want them to fall on the paper, or in the bouquet, I guess, too. And then I add the leaves on top of it afterwards. And this technique will give me better control over what the final bouquet will look like. You'll notice that with the greenery, I'm using different shapes and different sizes of those shapes. I find that typically the shapes that you would see in greenery are either footballs or arches or circles, depending on the type of greenery that you want to draw, whether it's eucalyptus or like a fern type of leaf or a palm type of leaf. So keep that in mind as you're drawing your greenery. And this is where a reference photo would come in handy. Most of the leaves that I'm drawing are like a football shape, so how I do that is to create 2 arches and sort of flick them at the end towards where they meet. And then that way it'll look like more like a leaf rather than a football, but still be that football shape. And then as leaves near the end of the stem, they often get smaller. So practice those shapes on another piece of paper and practice making them smaller and bigger before you create your final piece. So for this stem, I'm creating several stems within a stem, you could say, and at the end of each, I'm drawing a bunch of small circles, and that's like a cluster of circles, and that's just the type of greenery that this one happens to be. So like I said, pay attention to whatever reference photo you're using to create your flowers and create your greenery. Now I'm beginning with the biggest flower in my bouquet, which is the peony. And I'm starting with the outside petals before I move on to the inside petals. That way I can control how big my peony is. I find that peonies are really good in a bouquet because it just helps the composition when it comes to negative space and space that is filled. Peonies are great because they are so big and they have so much negative space, but they create a very nice balance to the piece that has a lot of either smaller flowers or greenery like this one. Now, another nice thing about peonies is that their petals are pretty easy to draw. They're basically just circles or sometimes ovals with a little bit of like squiggles near the edges just to give a crinkly effect. And then basically the center of a closed peony is just a bunch of squiggles together. So you could look at a reference photo of a peony and be very intentional about what those squiggles look like, or you could just be more loose with it and create your own. It's completely up to you, different style choices depending on how realistic you want them to look, but the effect would be very similar to one another. So for my peony, I did pretty much a combination of both of them, where I did some intentional lines that looked like very intentional folded petals according to my reference photo, and then others I just did some quick little squiggles. Now for roses, I actually like to start in the middle of the rose and create these little lines that intertwine and intersect. I highly recommend looking at a reference of a rose if you're going to include roses in your bouquet, because roses can be a little bit tricky to draw and it's a little hard to explain the techniques to use, but just look at the lines very carefully and look at what angles they go at and how they meet one another. Try to look at it objectively rather than as a full, 3D shape. Try to like flatten it in your mind's eye and really just look at the lines. I find that the center of roses look like little triangles intercepting one another, but that might just sound confusing to explain. So hopefully that makes sense to you in combination with what you're seeing me draw here. And to fill in the rest of the bouquet, I'm just drawing a bunch of small roses and a bunch of roses varying in size as well, and just filling in those spaces and filling out the bouquet. Now I'm going to prepare the watercolor. So what I do is I put all the colors that I want to use out on a clean palette, and then I add water to it, creating little puddles. So instead of painting with the paint that comes out of the tube directly, I like to create a little puddle and draw from that puddle instead. That way it will keep the beautiful watercolor effect as well as give me the ability to build up the color. So for the bouquet's wrapping paper, I'm just using a very light amount of some burnt sienna. And then for the peony, I'm trying to create a blush color using some rose and some burnt sienna and a lot of water. And that will create this lovely blush peachy tone that I can use for the peony. And I'm starting with the edge of each petal, and I'm starting with the center of the flower first, because these will be the darkest areas of the flower. And then I can just add in some water or some lighter shade of the puddle that I'm drawing from and create the rest of the color from that. And even though I've sped up this footage, I'm still going pretty slowly. That way I can really control where the shadows are and where the highlights are. And I can control the watercolor a little bit better. So from the darkest parts that I've placed on the petals, I'm taking just a little bit of water and pressing it lightly against those darker edges and bringing it out towards the middle of the flower. That way it will create this nice gradient from the darkest color to the lightest color and give an overall beautiful peachy look. So for this rose, I am actually using the permanent rose color that I used for the peony, but I'm not mixing any burnt sienna. I'm just using the permanent rose straight from the puddle. And keeping the flowers in the same sort of color family will help create a more cohesive look to the bouquet. So you might be wondering, how do I create a white flower? Well, one technique that I use is to use some blue along the edges of the petals, similar to how we did with the peony, and that will give the illusion that the flower is white because the blue will act like a shadow. And I'm just going back and forth between the blue and the pink flowers, or I guess the white and the pink flowers, just to figure out and play with where I think the colors would be best suited and how it would look in the composition of the whole bouquet. Now I like to spread out the pink flowers so that way the eye will be drawn to more than one part of the bouquet. Typically any cooler colors like blue will recede into the background, and any warmer colors like pink will come forward, so your eye will be drawn more towards those warmer colors. So just keep that in mind as you are making your bouquets. So for the greenery of this piece, I'm actually going to use a variety of greens. So I'm starting off with this darker, more true green that I've mixed with a little bit of burnt sienna to give more of that earthy look to it. And I'm adding some water if I want to lighten up the green, or I'm adding more of the paint if I want to darken it. With watercolor, you don't typically use white. You use the paper as the white, and so you would just use water to water down the paint, and that way more white paper can show through. And you would end up lightening the paint that way. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to create some lowlights and some shadows. And how I do that is by mixing my own black using burnt sienna and a little bit of blue. That way it won't create like this super dark pigmented super black. Instead, it will create more of a shadowy effect that I can water down or add more paint to make it a little bit darker. I prefer to make my own black because I find that making it creates more visual interest in the piece rather than using a black straight from the tube. But you're welcome to do either. It's up to you, whatever you prefer for your piece. Now with watercolor, it's best to go from your lightest colors to your darkest colors because it's easier to make something darker than it is to lighten it up. In this case, I am working in sections, so I don't have to worry about that too much. I wait for one section of paint to dry before I paint right next to it. So for this greenery, I'm starting off with yellow and then going on top of it with some green. And that way it will warm up the green and add a little bit more visual interest to the greenery in this bouquet. And I've also included some other, I don't know what you would call it, some other filler plants, not greenery because they aren't green, they're more of this browny red color. And I find that it adds a little more dimension to the bouquet, as well as, visual interest to the piece all around. So feel free to branch out and add in other types of greenery to your bouquet. And there you have it. This is the finished bouquet. If you liked this video, give it a like, leave a comment, let me know if you want to see more. Feel free to subscribe and check me out on my other socials. And if you like this piece, it's available on my website. Thanks for watching.